Let's turn to the 13th chapter of the book of Romans, and we're talking about civil authority. Okay, we're talking about civil government. Now, remember, we are not talking about any specific civil government. There is no civil government, including in this country, that is completely guided by biblical principles. I am not sure that civil government guided by Christian principles is even possible. Now, I've debated that with people, and when I say I'm not sure it isn't, but I'm not sure it is either possible. So I'm not just giving you soft soap when I say that. I really don't know. And that's something I've studied and thought about. I could teach history at the undergraduate college level, and nearly any kind of history you want. War, United States, China, Europe, Australia, because it's just one of those things that I like to read. I read history for relaxation. Now, if I really want to relax, I read Westerns. I'm like Eisenhower. And I think I'm in good company with that. But I've lost my train of thought. Let's get back to Romans.
Charles, you just made a statement that you don't know if it's Christian or not. The statement is not original, certainly, but I read it the other day. It works except when it doesn't.
Yes.
So that's kind of like whether we're a Christian nation or
yes.
Or not. It
yes.
works except the times it doesn't.
It's hard for me to believe that a system of socio-historical political system is biblical when it's based on greed. Now I'm just going to come right down to it. And capitalism and modern democratic capitalism is based on greed. It's usually kind of purdied up, we call it consumerism. But it means that everybody assumes you want more. And that is a working definition of greed.
What system's better though, Charles?
There isn't one. What I'm trying to say is, back to my statement that I don't think any governmental system is completely biblical.
And yet, according to Romans, it has its part in what God does.
Yes, and I will try to show you that.
The question I had is, when you think about the Old Testament, what God tried to do with Israel was to implement a theocracy, but I guess that never really worked either. Is that what you're saying? In the Old Testament, God tried to implement a theocracy, and then they asked for a king and for judges and all that. Well, I guess the judges was God's idea, and they asked for kings, so that never really worked either.
Well, no, it didn't. And remember, through the mouth of the prophet Samuel, God told them what would happen if they had a king. And everything happened that he predicted. But, now here is the thing. Let me come back to something. The only thing worse than bad government is no government at all. And that's what they had practically. God didn't intend it, but that's what they had practically during the time of Judges. And Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And friends, that means that the bigger, tougher, immoral people will rule. That is what is wrong with libertarianism. Because human beings, there's enough of them that are bad, you can call them sociopathic or whatever, that if you don't have something collectively more powerful than they are, that kind of person will run.
He who has a goal.
What?
He who has a goal rules.
Yeah, that's the golden rule. Okay. For rule, the third, let's go back to the second verse. Therefore, the person who rebels against authority is opposing the divine ordinances and will bring judgment on themselves. Now, you have to keep this in the context of what he is saying. The idea is that God instituted civil government to, as he's going to say, to punish the criminal. He uses the word punish those that do evil. This is not evil necessarily in the biblical sense. It is those who violate the social contract. See, societies are built on certain agreed principles. One thing that the Bible is in favor of is private property. There is no society that exists for very long that does not protect at some level or degree the ownership of property. Even in totally socialistic states, communistic states, in Soviet Russia, they had laws against stealing other people's property. Now, so much of the means of production were in the hands of the Politburo. So much of all the society was under the central control of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. But if you owned something personally and somebody took it, the Kremlin would come down hard on them. Most people find that very difficult, because I'll hear people say, well, certainly the Bible's in favor of capitalism because it's in favor of ownership of property. All countries, if they're going to survive, protect to some degree some private property. It just varies as to how much and which.
Charles, what about this in Israel? They got the kibbutz, they call them? Is that
Kibbutz.
Kibbutz? Do they have private property, or it's all communal property?
No, if you're part of a kibbutz, it's communal. But if you're not, and at one time in early days of the settlement, Jewish settlement in Palestine, the majority of people lived on kibbutzim. That's the plural, by the way. We spent a night in a motel owned by a kibbutz, bordering on the Sea of Galilee. Had a wonderful experience, went to a lecture that night about how it was organized. At one time, they had the idea that even children would be raised communally. And it didn't take them too long to recognize that didn't work, because the children did not bind with adults, and they would come up totally emotionally stunted and amoral. So they changed the rule. If you had a child, then your assignment in the kibbutz was to work in the nursery, taking care of your own child and other people's children. And that works. When we were there in 78, they had even gotten to the point where people lived in family units. They didn't live in barracks and all. And each family would go, and they had a communal kitchen, and when it was time to eat, some member of the family would go get the cooked food and bring it to the individual home. So they had learned from the fact that there's some things you just can't share without destroying humanity.
Where in the Old Testament does it talk about
What?
someone being condemned for moving the markers of a property?
Mhm.
Is it in Proverbs where it mentions that?
It's more than one place.
Okay.
I think there's in Leviticus, and Proverbs is hard against that, but see, they owned, I don't want to go there.
But in the year, weren't they supposed to give the property back? I mean, everybody was supposed to go back to their original.
Yes, there was.
So even if I had sold something to you in Jubilee year, it came back.
Yeah, actually.
Just never bothered to sell.
Actually, if they had stuck with the letter of the law, which they never did, people could only what we call lease the property for a time. That's what. Okay, but let's get back to this. See how complicated our relationship to civil government is. One of the problems is today, people don't want to think. And so they adopt an ideology that they don't have to think. All the thinking has been done for them. The only problem with that is it's not rooted in reality. And eventually reality wins.
So the Bible says.
What?
So the Bible says.
Yeah, well, because reality is God's will in the universe, in the political realm, for that matter. But so remember, it's complex, and try to think it through. Don't let somebody else always tell you what to think. That's my philosophy. It may be philosophy, but
Don't let somebody chew your meat and then put it in your mouth.
that's right. Okay. He said, "For rulers are no terror to those who are doing good deeds, but to those who are doing evil deeds." Now there, good and evil are not used in exactly biblical terms. It doesn't mean that the civil government enforces biblical right and wrong. It is societal right and wrong. They don't force you to have compassion on the poor, which I wish that our political system had a little more compassion for the poor. And one of the things that gets me, and again, I don't want to get too political, but how these kids that have come from Central America and inundated 60,000 of them, people think of them as things. They're not, but when you see them, they look like 10, 12, 13-year-old kids, and that's what they are. And I wish that people were more compassionate about it. I keep thinking I'm going to go on Facebook and bring down the wrath of the community on me. And what I'm going to say is, why is it that so many people say, well, they're criminals because they violated the law, when every day in San Antonio, somewhere close to 1,000 people run red lights. Are you call them criminals? And every year, 60% of the people that are killed in automobile accidents are killed because of drunk drivers. Do you think DUI? I don't hear anybody getting on the Facebook and saying, well, they've committed a crime, they're criminals. And they're a whole lot more danger to our country than a 10-year-old child from Guatemala.
The thing is, how did that child get all the way by themselves?
Yes.
No.
Well, I'm not going, what I'm trying to do is to get you to look and think before you speak. And now, can we have open borders in this day and time? Absolutely not. Because that would be like lowering the boundary between you and the world, which is infected with bacterial and viral things that would kill you if you didn't have a boundary. Now, see, the situation is more complex than the ideologues on either side. And to be Christian, sometimes we need to step back and look carefully and make some hard judgments. Will you always be right? No way, Jose. Nobody is right all the time. I don't care who it is. I don't care whether he's a rightist or a leftist or a centrist. That nobody is right all the time. What? Even me. Now, I am very much aware. I catch myself being wrong quite often. And I try to change it, but there's some things I haven't really come close to yet. Okay, he goes ahead to say, if you don't want to be in terror of the ruler's authority, do what is good and you will have his praise. Now again, this is not biblical morality he's talking about. It is societal. Now, even when the Roman government was persecuting Christians, the government, and we get a warped idea about that. It was only sporadically that the whole Roman Empire was anti-Christian. And one of the strange things is, if the emperor was a good Roman, he persecuted Christians more than people who were not good Romans, because it was a societal thing. But always, one of the things that the Roman government provided was you could travel from Persia to southern England. And if you were a Roman citizen, you could travel in peace. And one of the things that the Roman government did under the emperors was to eliminate piracy on the Mediterranean. We need some good Roman government on the Horn of Africa. Pirates have always been outlaws, and that's one of the things they provided. So you see, it's those kind of things that Paul is talking about. Paul recognized that his Roman citizenship was valuable to him as a missionary. And he's telling that. Now, he was eventually beheaded by the Roman government. And I doubt that Paul would have approved of that. And so, see, again, we want it black and white. There's people who say, well, if the government says do it, you don't have to worry about the morality of it. That's not, Paul's not talking about the morality of it. He's talking about the societal value involved. Okay?
And yet we condemn something like Sharia law. But it is a form of government.
What kind of government?
Sharia.
Sharia. Yes. Actually, and I would say this in the same sense I say that the Jews never completely kept the law of Moses. No Muslim ruler has ever kept Sharia law completely. Not even Muhammad. What?
Especially so.
Well, yes. And it's one of those things, that's the bane of human beings is ideology. That's one of my, since I was old enough to know what it meant, I've been anti-ideological. Maybe that's my ideology. But I think we need to use some intelligence and discussion. I am firmly convinced that about 95% of human problems can be solved in dialogue, open, honest dialogue. Now, are there some intractable ones? Yes. There are some things that you need, say, civil government with a sword. Because there are some people that they want their way. We usually call them sociopaths. You hear the word? That means somebody who refuses to live by the rules of society. And that's what Paul is talking about here. Now, so don't make this mean something it doesn't, but also accept the fact that as a Christian, I should go as far as I can in obeying the law. I must not use my being a believer to excuse me from obeying civil law unless the conflict is direct, immediate, and meaningful.
And what's so good about Daniel is that you see how that worked out, how God worked it out when Daniel was faithful.
Yes. See, Daniel was part of the governing elite in Persia. And I firmly believe that the book of Daniel is included in the canon of the Bible to show us how that the conflicts, and notice, he had conflicts. He was condemned to death. But God had a purpose for him and rescued him. But even there, as brilliant as he was, as wise as he was, he could not avoid conflicts between his commitment to God and his commitment to the ruler of the Persian Empire. I hope you're beginning to get a feel, I mean a gut level feel, for what Paul is talking about here, that will enable you to make your own decisions. The fact that you have to make a decision, Jesus brought out, you know, when they were talking about paying taxes, he said, show me a coin. They gave him a coin and he said, whose image and superscription is on this coin? And they said, Caesar's. He said, well then, give to Caesar, or return, literally in Greek, return to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. And people think, well, that settles it. No, that only says you've got to make decisions about it.
And about yourself.
What?
You have God's image on you.
Yes, and that's exactly what he's talking about there. Your innermost being, who you are, belongs to God. And you ought to never violate that. Be a person of integrity. That's what Job was, in spite of his ranting and raving at times, coming dangerously close to blasphemy. But God said, you see, he has integrity. That means what you hear and see from a person is what they really are inside. He's consistent. He goes ahead to say, for he is God's servant appointed for our good. Now, that's the thing. We've gotten this idea in our country that government is bad. It ain't so. It's not good, but it's not automatically bad because it's government. And if you really always use this, I have read a great many of the stories and histories about the gold rush in California. And friend, most of you in this class wouldn't have lasted 2 hours in a gold camp, because there were people there who were meaner, tougher, and faster on the draw than you would be. And there was no law. You could not, there was no marshals, there was no sheriffs. And finally, the miners got sick of it, and they appointed vigilante committees. And the only problem with that is the vigilante committees were as corrupt as the people. And so if you got on the bad side of the vigilante committee, you better head for tall timber fast, because they'd hang you in a second. And there were many people killed that shouldn't have been. So again, he's talking about government, civil organization, and institutions at that level.
Well, and even on a personal level, a lot of times what is for our good is not necessarily pleasant or what we would perceive as a good thing, yeah, but ultimately
it is
for our good.
See, he's talking about here, there are some things that are good for society that are not pleasant for us. We're in a situation in this country right now that's going to, if it continues as it is going to really make for problems in the future. And that's the disparity between those that have and those that have not. Because the greater the gap is between the haves and the have-nots, the more unstable is the society. That's what brought down the Roman Republic and caused the rise of the Roman emperors, was the disparity between the wealthy and the poor. The problem is the poor, when they get to where they completely outnumber the wealthy and begin to infiltrate the army and the police forces and things, you'll find that you order them to fire on the mob, and instead of firing on the mob, they joined the mob. And that has happened all through history. And now, do I believe we have to equalize the income of all people? No. But we have to have some kind of process by which the poor have hope. Because a man without hope is a very dangerous man.
Desperate and dangerous.
What?
Desperate and dangerous.
Desperate and dangerous. And a man with hungry kids is even more desperate and more dangerous. It's not a matter of ideology, it's a matter of facts. And do I have a solution for it?
No.
No. You beat me to it, Pam. Now, I know some things that aren't good and shouldn't work, but to settle it, we've been battling that problem in this country since about 1960. Oh, let's just say 1960.
LBJ.
And some smart men have made their mark, and nothing that's done has really worked. Is there a solution? By faith, I believe there is. But don't ask me to tell you what it is, because I can't do it.
Even Jesus said the poor will always be with you.
What?
Even Jesus said the poor will always be with you.
Well, we have misused that.
Right.
If you go back to the passage in the Old Testament he's quoting, the reason the poor will always be with us is that the rich have failed in their duties to take care of other people. And that, see, we get those little snippets of quotation and we don't go back and see what is there. And that's one of the things, Mike, that N.T. Wright does with Pauline quotations, is that he sees that Paul imports the whole narrative. If he makes a quotation from the Old Testament, all that's included in that narrative is part of Paul's thinking. And that's the same way with Jesus. And so, you remember when we had the series about financial stability and I've worked with Mark Tidwell on his sermon, and we went back into some of those Old Testament passages. Okay, let's go ahead to say, but if you're doing evil, you should be afraid, because they don't carry the sword as an empty symbol. In other words, civil government is appointed by God to use force, physical force. And that's one of the things I read and heard about a libertarian college professor that was all up in arms because of the militarization of the police forces. Well, if you want to watch channels, I say it's 137, 138 on Time Warner, and you'll see some of the militarized police forces. They have SWAT team from Detroit, Michigan, and I can recognize some of the streets there. And they have a SWAT team from Dallas, and likewise I can recognize some of the streets. The reason they're militarized is they're in a war. And they're in a war with the antisocial elements of society. And I'm thankful that the police are better armed and better protected than are the crooks. Now, there's some bad cops, but I've got many friends who are policemen. Had one for years who was a policeman in San Antonio, and had had a friend in Northern Virginia. I've described riding with him on Friday night in Georgetown. Let's go ahead. They're God's servants and his agents to do justice by punishing those who do wrong. See, he comes at it from several different directions. The idea is civil government is necessary for civilized existence. And if you don't have a stable and basically honest civil government, you will have barbarism and anarchy. And that's what Paul is saying here. Don't read more into it than Paul puts in it. It does not say that since, I've heard people say, well, God established 3 institutions. He established the church, his people, he established the family, and he established civil government. As if all 3 of those were equal. They are not. Civil government has limited sphere of activity. It's to keep the peace. Our ancestors knew what civil government was for. They called in the certain periods in the west part of our country, that includes Texas, they called them peace officers. And now, I think we could go back to that. It might help us think through some of the things. Because as far as I'm concerned, that is about as good a way to sum up what Paul is saying here about civil government as you can do in one sentence. They are to keep the peace. That means civil peace. I've shared with you getting called out in 1943 as a buck private in the Texas State Guard to a race riot in Beaumont. And coming down Center Street, which is one of the main drags in Beaumont, was this mob. And it had a sound that I wake up sometimes at night, still can hear. It sounded like a hive of angry bees, high-pitched, destructive. And our Captain Moon, he was an old iron pants horse cavalry colonel when he retired, and he said, front rank, kneel. Ready? Aim. And I'm telling you, that the silence was deafening. There's nothing that I've ever heard that sounds any more ominous than those bolt action on those 1903 Springfield rifles with an 18-inch bayonet on the end of them and copper-coated bullets that were dangerous within a mile. And the mob disappeared. I don't know where they went. But
they did it quietly.
They did it quietly and suddenly. Now that's what civil government is for, right there. Now that's, again, see, I'm using stories because stories tell us more than abstractions do. But there was a function of civil government.
Charles, can you expound a little bit on the use of the word servant, that they are God's servant? How, I mean, we know, I'll accept that God instituted this. Well, the idea of a servant
is somebody who does the will of another.
So,
Now, that doesn't, Linda, maybe I can help you this way. That doesn't mean that everything they do as servants of God. Now, that's the point I want to...
Okay.
Yes. You see, again, that's what many people want. Well, they're servants of God, so everything they do is okay. No, they are to keep the peace.
That's how they serve.
See, that's
Their service.
that's their service. Just like in the church, we've got servants what to do grace, and we got servants that do go.
Yeah.
You see, it's the same thing. We over generalize, and we're ideologically based. It's so much easier if I can just stop thinking and assume a position and I'm automatically right. It ain't so. You can't do that. Can't.
I don't want to ride a dead horse, but I'm just curious because in my New American Standard, they use the word minister, which is even more confusing, that they're a minister of God.
Well,
It uses that word a couple times.
yeah. The word is diakonos, and that means table servant originally. And remember, even that we get our word deacon from that. And they were limited. They were table servants. So the word itself is limited. This is not doulos, which is used of Paul when he is a doulos of Christ.
Bondservant?
What?
Bondservant?
Well, it means more than that. It's slave.
Okay.
Heard a fellow one time was making fun of preachers who want the title, you know, and he'd minister of this and minister of that. And so here I am, I'm the research minister, resident research minister at Oak Hills and that. But he said, why don't they just go ahead and put up there, instead of capital minister, put up capital slave.
Yeah.
And this is not the word for slave. This is the word for minister, diakonos. So, again, it's limited. I'm going to keep, you're going to leave here today with this ringing in your ears. Civil government's main purpose is to keep the peace. That's their main responsibility. Now, that has myriads of complexities. See, I've just talked about the idea that the difference between haves and have-nots is destabilizing, i.e., it makes peace difficult. And so doing something about that difference between the wealth of people is well within what God would have for civil government.
The message says, God also has an interest in keeping order, and he uses them to do it.
Very good. See, that he uses the word order and I use the word peace. I'm glad you have that, because while there are places I differ with him, that's one that I think he's right on. That's good.
And in verse 6, he's skipping on down. He says, that's also why you pay taxes, so that an orderly way of life can be maintained.
Good. That's exactly, see, peaceful. Let's just go on right quick. We got 5 minutes. Therefore, you must be in subjection, not only out of fear, but also because of your conscience. In other words, as a believer, I obey civil government because my conscience would be insulted if I didn't. In other words, I go further than is absolutely necessary because they have a good purpose, even if it's not to my benefit. Now there's where the rubber meets the road. it's easy to be in favor of a civil government who's doing something to enrich you, to make your life better and easier. But what about it when they're taxing you? That's the reason that tax comes next. People didn't like to pay taxes back then any more than people like to pay taxes today. But a tax is the price of living in a civilized society, because it's not going to happen automatically. And it's one of the bad things is that no government is as efficient as we would like it to be. And it's not a matter of people being crooks or anything like that. I've told you about my two brothers that worked for Exxon, and they found out something. Exxon wasn't a bit more efficient than was the federal government. And if you work in a large corporation, I'm going to say something for you two right there. If you work in a large university, you will find that that's true. It is the fact that the greater number of people involved in anything, the greater inefficiency there is. And it's what makes it so hard. I'm going to use Randy's sermon this morning as an example. How many times did he say, grace and go?
A lot.
Yes. But why did he do that? Because he was talking over the noise, and I'm not talking about people saying things. I'm talking about noise in the communication sense. It is more difficult to get an idea over to 10 people than it is to one. And every time you go up a multiple of 10, you go up logarithmically. And that soon runs, that's an asymptote if you make a graph out of it. And so you trying to get over to 1,000 people, it's just almost impossible, but it can be done.
He almost couldn't let the word grow not come out of his mouth too soon.
Yes. So back to this. Civil government was instituted by God to provide for the social peace or for the order. And we pay taxes in order to live in an orderly society. Now, do we wish it could be done more effectively? You better bet it, we do. And we can make fun of it. But deep down, Christians ought not to make fun of the concept of government. Because from what Paul is saying here, God has a stake in civil government.
And he by giving honor, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. We're going to talk about that, which again has a little different connotation than most people think about honor. But if you don't get anything else today, get that. God instituted civil government to keep the peace. Is Alicia over there?